Good afternoon. It's 12 noon in the eye, and May 4th 2021, approximately a month since my first video on the fraud and corruption in the Supreme Court of Jamaica. And I'm making note of the time and the date because I wanted you to come to the realization that I still have not gotten any kind of positive response or response at all from either the Chief Justice or any members of the team from the Supreme Court regarding the matters, which have pretty much given me a whole bunch of details. And it's important for me to continue this quest as well as battle, because in so doing, this is going to save other litigants and other parties that are going to be in my position in the future not be unprepared and know how to deal with these kind of issues. Hopefully, my exposing my experience of what's taking place in the Supreme Court will make the necessary changes take effect or be put into effect by the persons who are there to fix our business. Government agencies, the management of the court itself, and every Jamaican citizen who believes in preserving our fragile democracy. So this isn't being done just to be on air or do a video. I'm by the beach today again because this is where I come to relax. I grew up in Montego Bay, and on Saturdays, Sundays, and even midweek, one of our favorite treks was simply to go to the beach. In those days, it was Cornwall Beach or Doctor's Cave, and just relax, watch the water, go for a swim. But I found it was extremely relaxing, and hence in those days we never experienced stress. So I'm by the water again, just looking at people fishing and getting on with their lives, and hopefully most people I see here are retired or semi-retired, or they seem to be anyway. Young people are there fishing, going up and down on jet skis and on their yachts, and you name it, but they're here. And this is what I should be doing, not doing videos about corruption in Jamaica, more than 600 miles away from where I am right now. And in fact, when I do think about Jamaica or do anything about Jamaica, it should be productive. It should be something that I'm promoting my country for the benefit of all of us who are Jamaicans, because all of us want to see that island, our country of ours, grow into one of the best places on the planet. But that's not the case. If we're going to have the most important branch of government, the judiciary, namely the Supreme Court, being occupied by a bunch of persons who are determined to undermine honesty and decency and integrity and uphold democracy, and take for granted that all of us Jamaicans who are exposed to it are going to take the nonsense. It doesn't work, has never worked. We've never been that way. And those of us who live abroad, when we're here, we don't put up with the nonsense either. If we feel we're being victimized in any way, we stand up and we fight here. So why shouldn't we stand up and fight within our own country? So that said, I wanted to pretty much go into a detail, point for point, again, what happened, and asking every Jamaican, law enforcement, judges, attorneys who get exposed to this video to tell us or tell me directly, is this something that should be encouraged? Is it wrong? is it right? Is it illegal? Is it immoral? Is it unethical for what's taking place to occur? Because if we acknowledge that it is, then you should also play a part in making the change. So in July of 20 in June of 2012, the appeals court pretty much ruled against Capital One and their claim, telling them they had no standing or right to have filed a claim. And in that judgment, which was handed down and by Justice Brooks of the appeals court, was a full sitting of the court, they specifically in their written decision stated that me, Anthony Tharp, did not owe these people any money and could not have owed these people any money because the agreement for property that was bought was between corporations, not private individuals. And the corporate veil essentially drew that line. There was no liability for any outstanding money from me. Now, was there any outstanding money owed to these people? Because they were not part of any transactions. Either myself or the corporation that I headed at the time was involved. So that said, if the appeals court, the highest court in Jamaica, ruled that these people's case should have been thrown out, no money is owed to them, then I'm asking everybody that's exposed to this video to tell me if after a ruling like that from the appeals court is made and the appeals court remanded it to the Supreme Court for the claim to be dismissed in its entirety, then once it got there, did the lower court judges to whom it was put in front of, did they have standing to have allowed Capital One and their attorneys, John Graham, to continue the claim? Because essentially that's what they did. When John Graham went to the court and applied for an injunction against my business, which again had nothing at all to do with the actual claim or the property itself, but took out an injunction which stated clearly that they were restricting the defendants and other parties from having any relationship or doing anything with the property, including those of us who were executing projects and developments that had nothing at all to do with the agreement or the lawsuit they had filed. When that injunction was granted, two, it had the effect of pretty much stopping our business. The injunction itself was governed by a document which states, an undertaking that states that any damage and all damage that's done essentially would be the liability of Capital One. So any damage resulting from the injunction was compensatable by Capital One to the damaged parties. And that agreement or undertaking, that money instrument, that debt instrument, was binding and enforceable. So, and that was ruled on by Justice Beswick when she handed down her ruling in the Supreme Court dismissing the claim again. On two occasions she made it clear that there was no claim, no standing, nobody owed them anything, and therefore the matter was dismissed. So my question to law enforcement in Jamaica, or anywhere in the world for that matter, is when John Graham went to court and filed that Capital One was owed money after, or the Alexander Burnham Trust, after the appeals court ruled that they didn't, wasn't he in contempt of the court, especially from the appeals court? And when judges in front of whom that came, who looked at the case gave John Graham what you call it now, injunctions, and continued the case, and in fact granted any kind of order to John Graham regarding the dismissed matter, which kept the case alive, wasn't that in contempt of the appeals court's orders? And if it is in contempt of the appeals court orders, isn't that in fact undermining the standing of the courts and the superiority of one branch of the court as opposed to the other? Because if the appeals court ruled and the Supreme Court is the law court, why is it a Supreme Court judge issuing orders which essentially diffuses or neutralizes or disregards the appeals court's ruling? And in fact, I think I had said it earlier that in one instance where I had asked for the court to rule on an order to have the police investigate the fraud in the court, and the judge there said he wasn't going to do it because a lot of people could get into trouble. When that ruling was made, one of the comments made by that specific judge was, if I don't like the ruling, take it to the people across the street, in that kind of tone. And I guess that was saying take it to the appeals court, because the appeals court was across the street from the Supreme Court. So he made a statement, take it across the street to them people across the street. I mean, just the reference to the appeals court and the justices there as them people. I thought that was disingenuous of that judge, and in fact he was again discrediting and undermining the integrity of the appeals court and the appeals court judges who made that decision. And to state that, oh, if I don't like what I'm doing, take it across there, was also trying to say, well, him not give a hoots. If I don't like what I'm doing, take it across and make them deal with it. Ironically, when he did say that, I said leave to appeal. And instead of granting orders for leave to appeal, him said no, he's not granting any leave to appeal. So here on one hand he's saying take across the people across the street in a most derogatory tone, and then when I did ask for leave to appeal the ruling or the order, him said no, I'm not going to grant it. So what was that all about? So two, again I asked earlier, the continuing of the claim by these judges granting orders that allow the claim to continue, isn't that in contempt of the orders of the appeal court? And if it is, aren't these judges out of order, are exceeding their jurisdiction? Because they have no, as far as I know, a law court judge can't overrule the superior court, which is the appeals court. Then the other matter that I want commented on by anybody that's listening this is when John Graham went to Justice B. Morrison and applied for Capital One to become an administrator for an estate that doesn't exist, wasn't that fraud? He knows no estate exists. He knows Capital One was not appointed executor or administrator of anything or trustee of anything, yet he went to Justice B. Morrison and applied for an order for them to be appointed administrators over an estate that doesn't exist. Estate previously, I guess he was alluding to, was fully settled in probate in a U.S. court, where the executor and the deceased were resident, and they had nothing in Jamaica at the time he applied for such an order. So not only was there no estate in existence in New York or in Jamaica, because the Alexander Burnham Trust, which Capital One said they represent, had no property or no entitlement to property anywhere here in Jamaica. So when you take an application to a judge and say to the judge, give me an order for Capital One to become administrator for an estate that doesn't exist in Jamaica, on the premise that they need to settle the estate in Jamaica, or they need to represent estate property in Jamaica when there was none, wasn't that fraud? You look up the definition of fraud and you tell me, was not fraud? Did John Graham make an application using false allegations to convince a judge to grant an order for them to defraud people of their property? Well, I said defraud, but I guess that wouldn't give it up, because in my opinion it's fraud. But you tell me, law enforcement officials or officers who hear this tape or video, please let me know if I walk into a court and said to a judge, well, I am the executor for an estate or the trustee for an estate that doesn't exist. Give me an order so I can go and take other people's property using this order. Isn't that fraud? Now, the significant thing here is that when the application was made to Justice B. Morrison, the claim again was already sanctioned pretty much by the appeals court as not having any standing, or there was no claim. And all of that information was in front of Justice B. Morrison. And if it wasn't, then one should inquire as to why wasn't it there if these people are applying for orders after it went to the appeals court. Why wouldn't Justice B. Morrison look at the rulings from the appeals court? And if it was hidden, again, wouldn't this be fraud on the part of John Graham, hiding the ruling of the appeals court from Justice B. Morrison? But yes, say it wasn't hidden. Wouldn't Justice B. Morrison be in contempt of the orders of the appeals court to grant such an order? And also, wouldn't it be illegal and fraud itself, because the judge would have known the facts? He would have known that there are no estates, no property in Jamaica belonging to these people, and plus the appeals court had ruled and made that statement. So in so doing, could anybody out there explain to me how Justice Morrison was justified in making such or granting such an order against people's property? And then I wanted to just juxtapose that against the Constitution, which says no branch of government or arm of government or government itself or anybody can interfere with people's property. Was he interfering with people's property when he granted an injunction against property that the appeals court had already ruled was not within the gamut of these people, including John Graham? So you read chapter 3, section 15, or any section of the Constitution that deals with properties, a charter of fundamental rights and freedoms, and you tell me that when Justice B. Morrison went ahead and appointed Capital One as an administrator for property that they didn't legally own or existed, wasn't he in fact violating the Constitution? I think he was. I don't see how he could not have been. Then I also want to find out if, when John Graham took such an order where Capital was granted appointment as administrator for an estate that doesn't exist, and they took it to a U.S. court and filed it in a U.S. court, that Capital One is the administrator, quote unquote trustee, as a result of appointments from the Jamaica court, wasn't that also an instrument of fraud? Because they used that to now go to a U.S. court and asked that court to grant them orders, which was in effect violating the property rights of me and others. So, wasn't that a case for fraud? And wouldn't that fall under the new law that the Jamaica government enacted that's used to grab scammers? Because if you're using misinformation, written or otherwise, to steal people's property, wasn't that fraud? Or wouldn't that fall under that specific law? And I'm pretty sure it does from my reading. So I'd encourage you to read that law as well, and tell me if that action by John Graham was not fraud and Capital One and falls under the Scamming Act, or as I call it. Then when they went again to a U.S. court and filed in a U.S. court that I owed them $600 and something thousand as a result of adverse rulings, 2 adverse rulings from the Jamaica courts, wasn't that also fraud? Because they used that pretty much now to claim to get the trustee for my estate and the court there to authorize or grant a big okay for them to so-called buy my interest in a business that I previously owned, to which I was a director. So the action was they used a false claim to get orders, which they use now to get an agreement from the court to purchase my property, which was not owned by me by then, or not 100%. And 2, there was no money owed to anybody, because again the appeals court had made sure in their ruling, they stated that clearly, that I personally didn't owe anybody, or nobody owed Capital One any money, or the Alexander Burnham Trust. So when they filed that in a U.S. court and got the court to grant orders where they claimed they bought my interest, was that or wasn't that fraud? I believe it is, and it was. And on top of that, when they returned to Jamaica, the Jamaica jurisdiction and the Jamaica courts, the Supreme Court, and filed in the Supreme Court those orders from a U.S. court, which were had based on the filing of a fraudulent claim of $600 and something thousand being owed. Wasn't that again fraud? This time, using that order from a U.S. court to come into the Supreme Court to convince judges here and other parties here that they now owned my company, or the company they presumed I own, and all the interest in there, and then present that to the Jamaica Supreme Court, and did get judges to act on it, because I'm presuming that's the basis that these judges, especially those with their attitudes, Justice Kirk Anderson and others, to now allow another scammer, Alicia Robinson, and the scamming company that she represents, Fletcher Myers and Gordon, I think, to come into court and claim they are filing to withdraw money that doesn't belong to them, or financial instruments that does not belong to them and belongs to me and other parties. Wasn't that fraud? Because when you take a financial instrument, damages, again, it's property, and this is damages represented through a financial instrument via the Supreme Court that's being held, by the Supreme Court, and you go in and tell the judge that we decided we don't want our money and so the court doesn't grant orders or hear the matter on the money that's owed, is not defrauding us, defrauding me of my property. Because remember, damages represent property, real property, as protected under the Constitution again. So not only are they, in my estimation, they're violating my constitutional rights over my property, but when they set things up where I can't get my money, and essentially they claim they own my company, which owns part of the damages, and they're now claiming because they bought the company, they own that damage, is not stealing, or didn't they defraud me of not only my interest in the company, but defrauding me of money that the company was owed, money that was there for, to come to me as successor in interest of the company. So wouldn't that be fraud? I'm asking because with all that's going on, as I said before, I can't get any kind of response from the JCF, Integrity Commission, the Chief Justice, the Minister of Justice, Commissioner of Police himself. And yet, I see where they locked up this woman from NCB who stole or defrauded the bank of 100 and something million, I think. And we're talking about billions of dollars here. Again, I remind you about the police woman who they arrested, and as far as I know, she's probably still locked up after months and months for eating a bun and cheese in an establishment, something to the effect. Or there was this other policewoman who they recently say was on charges for submitting a fraudulent check, a forged check. So again, I need to know whether I am the fool, I'm the stupid one, I'm the one that's been defrauded, or what. And if this is going on, why isn't anybody doing anything about it? I'm doing this and I'm thinking of Central America, I think Honduras, where they just kicked out some Supreme Court judges, I think, because they claim corruption. Now, I don't know if these judges were corrupt or not. I'm merely saying it so that other people who hear this can be reminded that judges aren't saints. Judges are like everybody else, ordinary people. And what happens is you'll find honest people in every organization, and you're also going to find crooks who get inside those organizations and undermine those organizations. And it's when we don't do anything about it that we have problems. And if you have this false impression, this misnomer, as some people would say, that there's no corruption in the courts, you're just as dumb as me. Because not only is there, but go online and look up how many judges they fire and lock up every year in other parts of the world, including the great United States, because they're not perfect. And that's why it's important for judges who are honest and decent and want to do the right thing and not tarnish their names to stand up and demand that the court is clean, and not look at me to come victimize me, thinking when you come into court with your attitude because I am critical of and identifying corruption and proving it, because I have the evidence. You have the evidence in front of you because it's a part of the court records, and instead of you doing something about it, you're going to come into a courtroom or a hearing with an attitude against me and my partners. Then guess what? You're just as bad if you do that, and you're in support of the fraud that's going on. So I'll be back And I'm going to, I think I'm going to be releasing the information online, this information online within the next 2 or so days. I've done several videos, but I've held them with the shallow hope that the court, especially the Chief Justice, would adhere to some level of decency and professionalism and fix the matters at hand. But I haven't heard from him. I haven't heard from anybody in the court, including the registrars or anybody that's required to manage these situations. I haven't heard anything from the Miss Angwin, who has been one of the factors in holding up this thing from day one. So, and by right, they should exempt themselves from any matters pertaining to me, because there's definitely a conflict of interest. I did file a lawsuit in the very court I'm trying to get to cleanse itself, to clean itself up. I don't know how that's going to go. And that's why I support the idea of having an independent, not tribunal, but review board to oversee the courts, independent of any government entities, to oversee the courts, review decisions, and when you have complaints coming in from litigants like me, it's not handled by the same judges. Okay, there's a serious conflict of interest there, and ultimately there's going to be a whole lot of prejudice and bad mind, because people are vindictive and they don't feel you should be critical of them. But in any case, it's been proven that self-regulation is a bad idea. You can't have the police regulating themselves. You can't have any branch of government regulating themselves, or any organization. And that's why the Black Lives Matter movement in the US has brought to light the corruption that we already knew in terms of the police, and that policing needs to be reformed completely, and that independent oversight committees and boards needs to be established. I have nothing to do with the government and the police. You can't review yourself. And it should be the same in Jamaica, that we recognize the fact that this old idea that was deliberately put in play so that these things could continue and the courts and the judges could abuse their power and get away with it, of having them review or regulate themselves, is a bad idea. So we need to fix that. And we need to fix a number of other issues, and simple fixes. Again, for cases that are filed, a simple question and answer or sheet where litigants, especially if they're self-representing, just simply fill those sheets out and have them being reviewed by trained clerks to identify the nature of the claim, which division it should fall under, and so get it into the right area, and then have judges review the claim and determine, before the court is tied up in a whole bunch of paperwork, whether this claim has standing or not, and not just have a bunch of judges do it and kick it out so that we fall prey to corruption again at this early stage. But after it's reviewed, there are secondary or even a third committee that reviews, and judges give written decisions on these pre-claims or claims that are filed before we set up long-term drawn-out ideas that these things should be in front of the court. Because as the appeals court ruled and Justice Beswick ruled, Capital One's claim should not have been in front of the court in the first place. Them not have any standing or a claim. So why 16 years after the fact, the victims are still having to have conversations about getting their money and their damages, and the court to act in enforcing its own policy? Because the court is at fault here. The court allowed this thing to be dragged out into infamy by allowing judges who are either sympathetic or corrupt to give Capital One, through their agent or co-conspirator John Graham, leverage that shouldn't have been done. And so while he's driving around enjoying his life and getting paid to interfere with people's lives, we're stuck in this limbo, because the Chief Justice, Minister of Justice, the Commissioner of Police, the JCF, the other members of the staff of the court, the Supreme Court, aren't doing their jobs. And not only aren't doing their jobs, but undermining the court, because when they treat decisions from the appeals court as something to be stamped on and stepped on and not paid attention to, they're destroying our very democracy. So again, thank you. I'm hoping to hear from persons, but whether I hear from you or not, you need to play a role in fixing this problem. It is not right for a person's life to be just taken for granted. 16 years of my life, no, 16 years of my life and business, and I affect other persons and other parties, my partners, their families, businesses that were adversely affected and are still being affected, and we can't get some relief from the persons who are supposed to be fixing the issues. So something needs to be done. And as I said, until we fix corruption in the courts, our democracy is under threat. And if our democracy is under threat, then our lives, our freedoms are also under threat. Thank you, and you have a great week. Hopefully, the next time I put an insert, it will say that we got the courts to act, and we bring some closure to this matter. Have a good one.